Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask what many will say is among the most pressing political questions of our day. How can populists be defeated? Can it be assumed that their incompetence in power will lead to their decline, or is something more needed? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. In recent years, populism has gained remarkable traction across the globe. If you see populist leaders as leaders who stoke division and who peddle simplistic solutions that, for all their superficial appeal, cannot succeed, then the rise of populists is an unqualified bad. So what can liberals, broadly understood, people who recognise social diversity and complexity in policy challenges, what can liberals do about populism's rise? One view is that populists will precipitate their own demise by their incompetence in office. If they peddle simplistic solutions that can't succeed, then once in office, they are surely doomed to fail. Yet many populists, once they gain power, hold it. And they do so, it seems, not just by fiddling the rules, they also maintain their popularity. So what's going on and what can be done? Well, a new article in our partner journal, The Political Quarterly, seeks to answer both of these questions. It delves into different theories of voting behaviour to understand the roots of populist strength, and then it explores what the optimal strategy may be through which liberals can respond. And I'm delighted to say that the authors of that article join me now. They are Dr. Daniel Brieba, Assistant Professor at the School of Government at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile, and Professor Andrés Velasco, Professor of Public Policy and Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Daniel and Andrés, welcome both to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on. And let's delve straight into that central paradox that's in your article that I was hinting at in the introduction there. The populist leaders remain popular with voters even after governing poorly. Andrés, could you maybe just unpack that argument?
With pleasure, and thank you for the invitation to the podcast. The number one subject of conversation around the world is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was reelected even though he stormed the US Congress. There were people who died during that episode, even though he governed poorly the first time around. Donald Trump is not the only example of this, but maybe the most prominent one. If you look around the world, in the country right south of the United States, in Mexico, President López Obrador was in power for 6 years. The economy did badly. Crime rose. The homicide rate went through the roof. And nonetheless, López Obrador ended up with a record 60-some% approval rating, and he was able to handpick a successor, a woman who had been part of his administration and who was elected with nearly 2/3 of the votes. Those are two examples. They're not the only ones, but I could go on and on. And I think what they reveal is that the link between performance and popularity is much more complicated than we often think. Most social scientists, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the course of the podcast, most social scientists seem to think, economists, political scientists, etc., that if a president or a prime minister governs well, he or she will be popular. And if the person does not do a good job, he or she will be unpopular. And it's very mechanical, and it's pretty much based on economic performance. That seems across the world not to be the case. And I think that raises a fascinating question of what it is then. What other factors are then determining whether somebody is popular, unpopular, re-elected, or sent home?
That's great. Thank you, Andrés. And Danielle, do you want to build upon that? So Andrés has pointed out that we have a kind of intuitive notion that lack of success will lead to unpopularity. But we also have an idea in political science and social sciences more generally that that is what we would expect to see as well. What's the kind of standard theory around this that leads to that expectation?
Sure. So thanks for the invitation. I think the standard model is about instrumental voting. So people vote hoping to get results, hoping to get something back. So some people vote because they want to have high growth, right? Or low crime. So delivery is paramount. And I think that's what you always see, that we are all discussing about, if populists will deliver or not. So if they don't, then we should see them out of office. But as Andres just pointed out, you get Donald Trump reelected in spite of what he did. And in many cases, you get populists reelected that haven't delivered or not delivered very much. But there are variations on that model, right? In political science, you get the standard model is more ideological. You say, well, if I believe in a left-wing policy platform, then I will vote for a left-wing policy candidate and so forth, because I want those sorts of policies. Some people are more retrospective voting. So you say, well, let's look at how the economy did, and then I'll vote in that way. Or you might trust the person or the party. So that's more like balanced voting, right? So you say, if this person is competent or this party is competent, I will vote for that. But what unifies these different models is the idea that it's about the policies and the results. We think, along with other social scientists, notably Aachen and Bertels have pointed this out, that it's more about the social identities. And that's the big thing that's not being considered. And when you vote identity, it's not so instrumental. It's not just about what you're going to get back, but it's about who you are and the sort of people you trust.
Right. So do you want to explain a little bit further just what does identity-based voting actually mean in practice?
Yes. So
Daniel?
social psychology tells us that we are very groupish as humans. And so there are groups that we identify with and that are part of our own identity. So if I say that I am Chilean, that's a big part of who I am. Not necessarily for everyone, but for a lot of people. For some other people, it might be, I am from a certain social class or from a certain ethnic group. It might vary, but we all have social identities that are very important to us. So voting your identity would mean voting for someone who is part of your group or someone who you think will do well for your group. So it's about, my group being well respected, considered, and having a prominent place in the politics of whoever I'm voting for. So that means probably if it's someone from my group, it'll be someone I will trust more, someone I can identify with because I know that person is kind of like me or considering my interests and my way of being as part of what they will do in office.
Alan, if I may, let me elaborate on that. And let me change hats for a minute, stop being a professor and put on my hat as a former politician. I've run for office twice in my life, and I spent many days, weeks, months of my life campaigning, standing on a street corner, talking to voters. And my experience is very much that people approach you and get a conversation going with you and maybe express support on the basis of the kinds of things that Daniel was talking about. Do you elicit trust? Do you seem to be like the kind of person who would do the kinds of things they might want? Do you seem like somebody who will represent their values, their way of life? And after that relationship of trust has been established, after people have said, oh, you look like a nice guy, maybe I'd vote for you, voters say, oh, and by the way, what is your policy on subject X or on subject Y? And that stands the standard model on its head. Standard model says people have preferences over policies, and then they go shopping for the politician or the candidate who will in fact carry out those policies. In my experience, not only in my academic work, but in my experience as a candidate, it works exactly the other way around.
And how do you see that as working in the case that you gave us earlier, the cases of Trump in the United States and López Obrador in Mexico? Can you just walk us through how that is working in those cases?
Sure. I think in the case of the US, by now this has become a bit of a cliche, but let me elaborate it. There is a set of Americans, many of whom live in the Rust Belt states of the Midwest, many of whom are white. They're more males than females, probably, who feel that their identity has been disrespected, that the country is being run by the elites in the East Coast and the West Coast, that those elites tend to have not only a college degree, but tend to have been educated at elite institutions, and that they look down upon people who don't fit those patterns, who don't have a university degree, who didn't attend an elite institutions, who don't have a prestigious white-collar job. And Donald Trump may be a rich guy, but he's certainly not an intellectual. He may be from New York, but he was never accepted by the New York establishment as one of them. He comes across as loud, maybe a little vulgar, maybe a little crass. And therefore people say, oh, if you were the kind of man who was looked down upon by the elites, well, the same happened to me, and therefore you and I are in the same boat. Therefore, I can trust you to represent me and my values and my interests. You may be a little erratic, you may be a little loud at times, but, you're better than the other politicians who seem too scripted, who seem, too much in debt to the bankers, to the large corporations, to the elites, intellectuals or otherwise, in California or in New York. In Mexico, you get a similar pattern. Mexico was governed for many years by highly educated technocrats, most of them, but not all of them, linked to one party, the PRI. The PRI was in power for decades, and many Mexicans came to believe that the political parties were completely detached from the way of life and the interests of the average Mexican. They didn't speak like the average Mexican. They didn't reason like the average Mexican. They didn't go to the same schools or pursue the same hobbies. And as a result, here comes López Obrador, a man who gives press conferences every morning. The conferences go on for an hour or two. He talks about every subject under the sun. He does it in a way that is very colloquial, that is sometimes very confrontational, that does not resemble the way in which your standard Mexican politician speaks. And the voters say, hey, that's my guy. He seems to reason like I do. He seems to speak like I do. He seems to know the kind of world that I come from. And that makes him very popular, even though, again, the standards indicator of economic growth or job creation or crime abatement are in fact quite mediocre. Again, the US and Mexico provide two examples. We could talk about India, we could talk about Hungary, we could talk about Brazil or the Philippines. They all suggest a similar pattern.
Yeah, that sounds like a very persuasive account. I guess my question as a skeptical political scientist is, how do we know that it's right? I'm thinking with a lot of these populists, it seems that there's a genuine public desire, particularly for action on immigration. And although it may be that these populists don't deliver some of the outcomes that political scientists tend to think that most people focus on, economic well-being, if voters are focused on that deliverable, then it may be that actually the populists are quite good at delivering it, and therefore they do fit into the kind of standard model of how people vote. Do we have clear reasons for doubting that account? Maybe Danielle, you want to come in on that?
I think that policy results get read through an identity lens. So when you see that Obama or Biden deported hundreds of thousands, or I don't know the figure, but a pretty large number of people, and the machinery was working, that just didn't get reported, and that just didn't seem to register with voters. In the UK, immigration was a huge issue, according to polls, until conservatives were in power and Brexit got done. And then even though immigration was still high, polls showed that immigration wasn't really an issue. And now that you have Labour in government, it may be resurging, right? So it is when you distrust the party because of what they represent, then the issue gets highlighted again. And you get this in other spheres. Again, when Trump says he's delivering growth, that gets interpreted as something huge. But when the Democrats deliver growth, then it doesn't get interpreted in the same way. So I think it isn't that results do not matter at all. I think it's important to stress that we do think that delivery is important. I mean, if people lose their jobs and see inflation rampant, that of course that will matter. But we just don't think that is enough of an explanation of what's going on, because it's the narrative together with the policy. What we argue in the article is not that policies don't matter, but that they are the end product, what embodies a certain political narrative and a certain political identity that makes it coherent. And people say, yeah, that's what these guys are about.
That's very interesting. So, a lot of people are saying in relation to Trump now that, well, his policy failures are going to start to stack up and become more obvious to people. And as that happens, his popularity will decline. And similarly, so we're recording this in the UK just a few days after the local elections that led to the election of Reform UK, which most people regard as a populist party. to executive office within a lot of local councils in parts of England. And again, lots of people are saying, well, now they're going to have to govern and they're going to find that very difficult, and that will lead to a decline in their popularity. What do you say about those expectations that people have? Are those just wrong? Are they just a bit simplistic? What would you say?
I think simplistic or mechanistic may be the right way to describe them. Again, as Daniel was saying, we are not arguing that delivery or performance are entirely irrelevant. When a country goes through a massive economic crisis or financial crisis or inflation crisis, of course, that has an effect on the popularity on the person governing. But that link is not linear, is not simple, is not predictable. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you ask Republicans and Democrats on their views of economic performance in the US, it turns out that when the Democrats are in office, Democrats tend to evaluate the state of the economy as being quite good, and Republicans feel exactly the opposite. Then you change the occupant of the White House, and the views reverse, even though the numbers are almost exactly the same. The same holds for a number of other indicators. It is extraordinary, for instance, in the US, on the issue of the pandemic and the policies to contain the pandemic, how the views on the effectiveness of, say, masks varied massively depending on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Clearly, the evidence is out there. We need not get onto the debate of how useful or useless masks are, but you'd expect people who belong to different parties to more or less have a convergent view on how good or bad this policy is. No such thing. Another example, when Trump was elected the first time around, his big claim was, I will bring jobs and industrial recovery to those regions of the United States that were deindustrialized and where a lot of working men, and I say men because most of them were men, had lost their jobs. Well, go look at what Trump did in those states during his mandate. And in fact, the share of industrial employment did not rise at all. The idea that you impose tariffs, you pick a fight with China, and suddenly manufacturing jobs begin to fall from the heavens into places like Detroit or Gary, Indiana, or Toledo, Ohio, that simply is false. And nonetheless, when those people had a chance to vote for Trump, they voted for Trump. And in fact, they delivered those states to Trump in the last election. Again, this is not systematic econometric evidence, but there are people out there who've tried to provide more systematic econometric evidence. And in many cases, it points to this direction. The link between performance and popularity and electability is, as Daniel was pointing out, mediated by something else. And that something else is a relationship of identification, trust. You belong to my tribe, and therefore I cut you some slack. If things are not going so well, at least you're trying. I believe that you're doing your best. If the other guys are in office, that's a different kind of business.
Great, thank you. That account of voting behavior is really clear and really important. So thank you for that. Let's move on then to what's perhaps the most significant question in this discussion, which is how then do liberals, broadly understood, so non-populists, respond?
Can I add one thought? Because we were talking about delivery when it comes to jobs or when it comes to immigration. But there's another point that we make in the article, which is just as worrisome, I think. And this is bearing on the issue of, say, the January 6th events in Washington, or what happened in the Brazilian parliament when Bolsonaro was in office. It is not simply that performance when it comes to economics or job creation has a tenuous relationship with popularity. When populists, in fact, step on democratic rules, when they limit personal freedoms, when they storm parliaments, that does not seem to cause many voters to say, hey, that's enough. I may have liked you in the past, but I will not tolerate that sort of behavior. The same is true in places like Hungary or India or Turkey, where semi-autocratic or at least illiberal Democrats have governed in those countries. They have, played fast and loose with democratic checks and balances. And this seems to make very little difference to the opinion many voters have of them. And that's another complication, I think, and one that should worry anybody who's, cheering for democracy, checks and balances, liberal institutions, and that sort of thing.
And I guess that relates directly to the bewilderment that many liberals feel of how can it be that Trump remains so popular post
Absolutely.
January the 6th? How can people not recognize that that rules him out of the game in many ways? Yeah, good. Daniel, do you want to pick up that question of what the response should be then to the populist challenge? How do liberals address this?
Sure. We argue in the article that the main thing, the first step in this direction is for liberals to recognize this problem that we've been talking about how people vote through an identity lens and not just through policies, because that's the starting point, right? So we think that liberals should start playing the identity game instead of just pretending it doesn't exist. And that means appealing to identities, but doing so in a liberal way. And I think that's the key. So we argue for doing a politics in where we try to reinforce identities, but make them highly inclusive identities. And we argue mainly for as for liberal patriotism as a way of doing that. The key is that because populists always divide people between them and us, and we're the good guys and they are the corrupt elite, the only way to counter that is by providing a more powerful identity, but one that unifies rather than divides. We are aware, of course, that patriotism, when we call it nationalism, has a pretty bad name, and I think that scares liberals of talking about nationalism because you get into blood and soil nationalism and wars and so forth. But we think that's a mistake because nationalism has also a long tradition, recognized in the politics literature, of course, of being a highly unifying force that has promoted equality and class solidarity. The creation of the NHS is a really good example, I think, created just after the Second World War at a point of high national solidarity. And that's what nationalism can achieve. So we think that might be a way forward.
And what does liberal patriotism look like in practice? Andrés, do you want to go for it?
Yes, I think it looks like the sort of thing you've seen in Canada or in Australia in recent elections, in which a man who wants to be the Prime Minister of Canada can stand up to Donald Trump, but not on the basis of saying that to be Canadian, you have to be white and Christian, on the basis of saying that there's some values that Canada stands for. Canada is a country that is diverse, it's a country that welcomes immigrants, but it's a country that stands for democracy. Or as, Mark Carney put it when he went to the White House a few days ago, there are certain things that are not for sale. We've seen something similar in the most recent Australian elections, in which Labour was re-elected by a very wide margin. And on the day of the election, Mr. Albanese says these are votes that have endorsed what I would call Australian values. We've seen similar positions in other elections in Europe, in Holland, for instance, where Green candidates and Labour candidates, again, have said what makes you Dutch is not your surname or the color of your skin. What makes you Dutch is the adherence to a certain set of values, like respect, like pluralism, like inclusion, which are essentially Dutch values. To put it differently, I think that patriotism or that nationalism that we're arguing for can be based on shared values, on shared political institutions, and on shared culture as well. Ultimately, we love our homeland because of the quality of life there. And, that life can be reflected in a common attachment to a certain dance or a certain kind of music or a certain kind of food. Those are the things that bring people together. Those are the things that can make one be a proud Chilean or a proud Brit or a proud Canadian. And therefore, I think liberals should not leave that material to the right-wing nationalists, to the populists. You can be a liberal, you can believe in liberal values and be a patriot at the same time. Not only is that plausible, we think, And we argue that it is politically necessary and politically effective.
Can I just add to that a little?
Tanya?
That if you look at the social psychology literature about what makes a good social identity, there are two features of it. A good identity provides belonging, a deep sense of belonging, but also of distinctiveness. And I think a flaw in the way liberals have thought about patriotism in the past is that they just go for the adherence to these common sets of institutions. So you have Habermas and constitutional patriotism and different variations of that theme in Cécile Laporte's work. But it's all about the institutions, which are quite universal because they're Enlightenment based. And that we think that's necessary, that's very valuable, but it's not enough. You need to create an identity that provides more distinctiveness as well. And that is what you find, that you have to celebrate some distinctive local features of your culture, your country, the beauty of its mountains, way of life, the pub, whatever it is. So this is not about endorsing an official culture by no means, but it is about creating a sort of narrative that makes you proud to be from where you are. And that has to be distinctive. It cannot be just reliance on universal values. It could be the particular way those universal values are enacted in your country, but you still need something more that isn't just a purely political thing about values and constitutions, but about the way of life and how that unfolds in your country that's quite distinctive and that you particularly love.
And you quote George Orwell in the article talking about the features of English civilization, as he says, and you say it's somehow bound up with solid breakfasts and gloomy Sundays, smoky towns and winding roads, green fields and red pillar boxes. So that's exactly the kind of thing that you're trying to evoke there. I was going to ask exactly about this kind of thing, though, because, if you look at what Anthony Albanese said after the Australian election, he said, today the Australian people have voted for Australian values, for fairness, aspiration, and opportunity for all. Those sound like incredibly undifferentiated values. Just about anyone, anywhere of a liberal disposition could sign up to those kinds of values. So I guess you're suggesting that might be part of the narrative, but that isn't the whole narrative. And presumably elsewhere, Anthony Albanese has talked about the kinds of more specifically Australian bits of that narrative as well.
No, I think that's exactly right. As Daniel was saying, you need to start from liberal values. Otherwise, your patriotism is not liberal patriotism. But you need to explain very clearly, and not only explain, you need to provide examples that resonate with people of how those values are present in the culture. And it may be a historical figure, it may be a local cultural practice, but you need to appeal to those things. Put it differently, a common mistake of centrist reformers, liberals, Democrats, call them what you wish, has been to play too strongly the cosmopolitan card. And please understand me correctly, I am not against cosmopolitan values. I am not against migration. I am a migrant myself. I am speaking in a language that is not my native language. So I am all for people getting along and understanding each other across cultures. But ultimately, as Daniel was saying, politics is about belonging. It's about rootedness. It's about feeling that you belong in a certain place and you share that place with other people. And a good politician knows how to take that value that is universal and make it Canadian or Chilean or Australian by means of an example. Let me illustrate that by recalling what the new Prime Minister of Canada said on the night that he won the Liberal primary. Carney said, he was picking a fight with Donald Trump. He said, in trade wars, as in ice hockey, Canada always wins. And of course, it's not the trade bit that catches your imagination, it's the ice hockey bit. Ice hockey is the place where Canadians, rich and poor, meet each other. They meet at the rink, they have a beer, they watch a game. That is one shared feature of Canadian culture that cuts across class, cuts across region, cuts across origins. And therefore, you can be for democracy, you can be for free trade, you're also for ice hockey. And I think that nails it. And that's what's made someone like Carney such an effective politician. He's a central banker. Most central bankers don't make very good politicians. He's the exception that confirms the rule.
Why is this so hard? The argument that you lay out for it seems very obvious and very strong. And yet there are very few liberal politicians who have really found a way of speaking in a way that responds adequately to populism. And we've talked about two examples there, but they're examples who are doing it in the face of a very strong threat from Trump that has maybe done quite a lot of the work for them. Danielle, do you want to pick this up? Why does it seem to be so difficult for liberals to do this?
Well, we think it is in great part because of what we were saying at the start, that liberals have relied on a wrong model of politics, which thinks that it's about voters getting what they want in terms of just purely instrumental voting. So it's about, if you think that voters just respond to policies and deliverables, then you're going to talk in that language and not in the language of identity. So it's very simple, but it's also difficult if you rely on other assumptions. And well, that's part of a broader argument with Andrés on liberals relying on what you could call an antiquated or at least insufficient view of human nature, which thinks that liberal politicians, not necessarily liberal philosophers, but mainstream liberal politicians generally think that, they rely on a view of humans as individualistic rather than groupish, rational rather than emotional, that they think about policies rather than about values. So we think that is the mental model that liberals need to change if they want to be more effective. I think that's at the heart of it. I don't know, Andrés, if you want to complement that.
Yeah. No, I that's exactly right. We liberals, Democrats, or centrists come at politics with a model of politics in our head that happens to be the wrong model. And it is the wrong model because it is predicated on a model of human nature, which is just wrong. From everything we know from colleagues in brain science, psychology, sociology, anthropology, human beings are not rootless calculating machines. We are not serene utility maximizers. We are not people who are naturally inclined to treat everyone the same, to uphold universal values. We can get there, but it takes some work. And therefore, we need a politics, a liberal politics that is rooted not on the way we wish people ought to be, rooted in the way people actually are.
Final question then to you, Andrés. You're sitting in London. Many of our listeners are also here in the UK. How would you translate that abstract advice into specific advice for Keir Starmer?
Very good question. I'm probably not the best placed person to answer that. I live in London, but I've only lived here for 6 or 7 years. I'm not an expert in British politics. But I'd say two things. The first one is we should learn from populists the art of controlling the agenda. We all talk about Trump all the time because Trump makes it impossible for us not to talk. He is throwing idea after idea or initiative after initiative every day. I live in London. I read the British press every day, and there are days that go by, and I simply don't think of the Prime Minister. He's nowhere to be found. He is not setting the agenda. He's not controlling the agenda. He's not making the British public talk about him in the same way that other politicians, many of them populists, simply force the conversation upon the electorate. That is idea number one. I think idea number two is that the kinds of issues that we were talking about have a British incarnation. We're beginning to see Labour do a bit more of that. There were certain symbols of British patriotism which in the past were limited to the Tories, were seen as sort of conservative emblems, maybe not so much anymore. I think the Labour Party could very, very usefully do more of that. Again, this does not seem, this need not retreat into jingoism or nationalism of the ugly kind. On the contrary, you can have a patriotism which recognizes Britain as it is today. It is a society of immigrants. It is a country that is very diverse and very multicultural. But to some extent, that can be turned into a political weapon. And I think Labour has not yet learned how to do that.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think when I hear Keir speak, it's exactly the model of deliverables. He's always talking about how the Labour Party will deliver, how his government will deliver, and it's great to deliver, but it's not often rooted in a narrative that makes it as the end product of a coherent identity that gets expressed in certain views and policies. So with the rise of reform, Labour is very tempted to become ever more hardline on immigration, for instance. And that could work, but only if you provide a narrative that makes it coherent with who you are. And I'm not sure Labour wants to do that or should, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem of just being, when you start copying policies of reform, who expresses that identity much more clearly and better, then that's why you become a copycat, because people say, well, you don't really represent those values. So I think the way for Labour to contain the rise of reform would be to propose an alternative identity, not just copy the policies and talk about delivering. I think that would be my view of why what we are saying is a bit different from what mainstream liberal politicians usually do.
Well, Danielle and Andrés, that has been a great conversation. You've persuaded me. It's a fascinating article, and there's so much important stuff in it. So I hope lots of people will be inspired by this podcast to read the article in full. Thank you so much to you both. We have been discussing the article, The Populist Playbook, Why Identity Trumps Policy and How Democrats Can Adapt, by Danielle Brieba and Andrés Velasco, published earlier this year in the Political Quarterly. As always, we will include the details in the show notes for this episode. And if you haven't taken a look at it yet, do remember that the Political Quarterly is a journal that, much like this podcast, seeks to make the latest research about politics and policy accessible and relevant to wider audiences. So it's well worth exploring. I'll just add, actually, this is not in my script for the outro, but just listening to the conversation, I recommend also that listeners take a look at a couple of our earlier episodes with my colleague Mark Steers, whose book called Out of the Ordinary looks exactly at what we can learn from the work of George Orwell, other mid-century thinkers, and how that might shape the discourse that politicians use in the contemporary world. So well worth exploring that as well. Next week, we will be asking how we should think about the existence of religious schools. To make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.